I'd like to begin by just summarising what happened between 1942 and 1945 in Sandakan and in Borneo, where almost 2,500 Australian and British prisoners of war had been sent from Singapore after the fall of Singapore, from Changi prison. They were, over those years, flogged, beaten, tortured, starved, flung into bamboo cages, denied medical care, and finally force-marched to death. 6 came home. In 1943, some of the officers were sent to Kuching, but 6 survived the entire experience of this horrific prison camp. And it was the worst place to be sent in either the Pacific or European theatres for a prisoner of war. The death rate in German prisoner of war camps was about 4 to 5%. The death rate in Japanese prison camps was 30 to 35%. The death rate at Sandakan was almost 100%. As I wrote this book, I felt a revulsion, a sense of disgust rising up inside me. After all, I am a human being as well as a historian. And that revulsion has to be managed, because you'd feel naturally a revulsion towards the Japanese nation, which is irrational. And I sort of corralled this sense inside me into what became the introduction to the book, which is a letter addressed to the Emperor of Japan, Emperor Akihito, who is the son of Hirohito, who was then the supreme commander of Japan in the Pacific War. My letter addresses the failure of the Japanese regime, or any Japanese government, to issue an acceptable expression of regret and remorse and an apology to the families who are living with us today. This is living history. It is not something long forgotten which no one knows about. It is similar, in a sense, in a context, to the apology by Kevin Rudd to the indigenous people. It is apology in a completely different context to the victims throughout Asia of the Pacific War and the Japanese military regime. Now let me just, for those of you unaware of Sandakan, and it is a word, shamefully, that is very little known in our own country. At the fall of Singapore, the greatest humiliation in British military history, some 50,000 Australian and British prisoners were herded together into Changi. From there, groups of them were brought together and told, some of them volunteered, promised better conditions, were sent to various corners of the Japanese Empire. 1,500 Australians were sent to Sandakan and a town on the east coast of Borneo. Many more were sent to Burma, others to Japan itself. Those who were sent to Sandakan were set to building an airfield 8 miles west of the prison camp, to which they marched every day for almost 3 years, 2.5 years. They were sent to this prison camp. They were, as the commandant, the Japanese commandant, and I'll just read very briefly what his instructions to them were. This is Hoshijima, the bloke who ran the prison camp for most of the time they were there. "You have been brought here to Sandakan," he told them, "to have the honour to build the Imperial Japanese Forces an aerodrome. You will work, you will build this aerodrome if it takes 3 years. I tell you, I have the power of life and death over you. And you will build this aerodrome if you stay here until your bones rot under the tropical sun." Hoshijima, later tried as a war criminal and hung. Now, what then happened was an experience that already was beyond many of our imaginations. They were beaten, they were tortured. A bamboo cage was built to where they were flung if they committed the slightest offence, and on the slightest pretext. Later, this punishment became indiscriminate. Many were tortured individually for, such as a young man called Darlington, half Aboriginal. He suffered what was called the knee torture, where they put a bamboo or a pole of wood under your knees, force you to kneel on spikes, and then Japanese guards would seesaw on either side of the wooden pole. Absolutely excruciating pain, but far worse was to befall these prisoners in the ensuing years. The Allies gradually gained control of the air, and anyone who knows anything about the Pacific War will know that the victor was the one who controlled the air. Churchill learnt that to his horror at the sinking of the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, which rendered the British without a navy in the Pacific. The Allies gradually controlled the airspace over Borneo and were starting to bomb in late 1944 the airfield and render it useless. But let me just say, before I get to the end, to the beginnings of the death marches, there was an extraordinary event which helped me to write this book, as well as helps, I hope, the reader to understand what these men endured. And it was an incredible story of inspiring story of heroism and courage on the part of the Australian and the British prisoners. They organised, with the help of very brave civilians on the outside, an underground, a resistance movement, which rose up under the very noses of the Japanese. This resistance movement involved smuggling into the prison camp medical supplies, food. They sent messages in and out of the camp to civilian internees who were interned in Sandakan Bay on an island. And eventually, it involved smuggling into the prison camp the parts required to build a radio receiver. Now, this radio receiver was gradually assembled and built by a man, or by several men, but particularly under the control of a man called Lieutenant Rod Wells, whose name you may know. He went on to become very prominent in ASIO. But at the time, he was a young lieutenant, and he put together a receiver with the help of Lieutenant Gordon Wainton. I want to mention their names because they are critical. The receiver was built. They siphoned off power, voltage, from the electricity generator, which was powering the prison camp. One of the members of the underground was running the generator. So what he would do, we would gradually raise the voltage at night to a level where they could then take off the voltage required to power the radio receiver. Now, I'm not an electrician. Some in the audience may tell us how this works, but I understand enough to realise that in the early instances when they tried this, he put a surge of voltage on and the camp lights blazed brightly to the astonishment of the Japanese. So Captain Lionel Matthews, who was Wells' senior officer, who was in charge of the prison underground, the prison resistance, an extraordinary man, he urged the voltage raised gradually. And on the night one night, they all gathered around the radio, midnight, and they heard crackling onto the air the chimes of Big Ben, which was, of course, the BBC World Service. In the ensuing months, they heard, the first news story, I should say, was a story of how to grow hops in Kent. So they learned how to make beer. Oddly appropriate. In the ensuing weeks and months, they learnt so much about the war, because they were hearing of Japanese ship movements. They were hearing about the fall of the Solomon Islands. They were hearing about the fall of Papua. They were hearing about the Battle of Midway. And they were learning the extent to which the Japanese were losing the war. And they were taking these down with pencil and dispatching them to the civilians on the outside. And eventually the underground had little drop boxes and hidden caches all over the jungle outside the camp and in Sandakan itself. An incredible ring just underneath the noses of the Japanese. And of course, eventually they went too far. They took too many risks and they were betrayed. It was a callous act of extortion. A bloke simply put them into the Japanese in exchange for money. A spy. And the ringleaders, some 80 civilians and prisoners, were rounded up. They were taken to what was called the House of Torture in Sandakan. And for weeks, these men were subjected to the most hideous tortures imaginable. One, of course, was the rack, which is medieval, but there were far worse in store for them, which I won't go through, simply to say that the rice torture, to which Rod Wells was subjected, did involve pouring raw rice into a man's stomach and then filling his stomach with water, at which the rice expanded with hideous and excruciating results. Rod Wells survived this. So did Captain Lionel Matthews, and neither man broke. They had names which they could have divulged to the Japanese, and they didn't give a single man's name away. One of whom was Russ Ewan, who attended the launch of this book, and he owes his life to the fact that his name wasn't divulged to the Japanese, because he was a central cog in the underground. The repercussions went on and on. There was a revolt in the centre of Borneo by native people. The events brought home to the Japanese that not only were they losing the war outside of Borneo, where MacArthur's great island-hopping campaign northwards was simply bypassing Borneo. They were left to rot on the vine. But they were losing the war inside Borneo because the natives were rising up. The prisoners had set up this astonishingly brilliant underground system. The crackdown was brutal and ruthless, went on for a long time, and it culminated in their decision to enact to the letter the Japanese policy, which was to exterminate the prisoners, leave no trace, annihilate them, leave no evidence, leave no witnesses of our humiliation. because defeat and humiliation of defeat was in many ways far worse to the Japanese mind in Borneo and in parts of the wider empire than witnesses to their war crimes, which at that stage they didn't regard as such. They believed through their ignorant prism that they were enacting the orders, ultimately, of Hirohito. Now, the extraordinary thing is that the way they were going to destroy these men, of whom about 11 to 1,200 were living in January 1945, their choice was to use them as draft horses. They needed to escape the coast because the Allies now were bombing Sandakan. So they burnt the prison to the ground, got the men together and compelled the first 500, so-called fittest, to commence marching inland. Now, these fittest men, of course, had now been subject to years of torment. They suffered terrible diseases. They had terrible tropical ulcers on their legs. They were dressed, well, they had bare feet. They were dressed in loincloths, many of them. And these were the fittest. And they were set off in batches of 50 and marched 165 miles, they were expected to march, loaded up with Japanese medical supplies, Japanese stockpiled food and ammunition. Now, I've walked in their footsteps and I've seen the country. It's not as exhausting as Papua, as Kokoda, as the Kokoda Tract, but it is a tropical country. I mean, it is incredibly humid. One of our party dropped out. You go through swamp, you go on a gradually rising incline towards the foothills of Mount Kinabalu. When these men fell, which they inevitably did, what was called the Killing Platoon at the end of the Japanese lines would come up and dispatch, through either clubbing to death or shooting, any prisoner who couldn't move, who couldn't go on. And it went on and on and on. And there were mass slaughters, and there were individual men just sitting under a tree saying to his departing prisoners, I can't go on. Tell my wife I love her. Tell my children I love her. I love them. At which point he knew what was coming, and it was usually a gunshot to the head. Now, the second march, then the next almost 500 men were almost forced at bayonet point out of their stretchers because so many of them couldn't move. And they were then prodded and goaded over the same path into the heart of darkness. Borneo, a beautiful country, but at this time it was hell on earth. These men were far worse off, most of them. And of the survivors, little more than 100, ended up in a place called Ranau, a town in the heart of Borneo, where by this point, in about June 1945, only 6 survivors of the first march were still alive. Just 6. Now, I'm just conscious of the time, but I just want to tell you that the last march had only 75 men, and that goes beyond is incomprehensible in its horror of what happened to these 75 stretcher cases who couldn't move and stumbled as best they could until all of them were dead within 5 to 10 miles, most within the first 5. This was a policy of mass extermination. It was in percentage terms, one of the worst atrocities of the Pacific War. Indeed, the Second World War. And there was, however, justice done. The perpetrators, the guards, all the way up to the commander of the Japanese prison network in Borneo were tried in 1946. And I have to say that this was not victor's justice. They had very well-trained lawyers acting on their behalf who were flown in from Tokyo. Cambridge educated, one of them. And this was a long, drawn-out trial. I mean, the perpetrators were, however, found guilty, either executed or imprisoned. And it was a tribute to Atul Moffat, who was a prosecutor on the ground, who led a brilliant case against them. But I will say that the Japanese thought they might get away with it because they believed there were no witnesses. But as I said before, 6 came home. And of those 6, 2 were regarded as reliable witnesses, or were fit enough to be witnesses, one of whom, Stipkowicz. Subsequently, some have accused him of collaborating with the Japanese. Others have said he did whatever it took to keep him alive. And certainly the 6 were very resilient and very tough. But as Keith Bottrell said after the war, one of the 6, he said, if you were selfless on that death march, you're as good as dead. It was Darwinian. it was a survival of the fittest. Stiklewicz, however, had a prodigious memory. And he appeared at the war, when he appeared at the War Crimes Tribunal in Labuan, in a tent on Labuan Beach, the blood drained visibly from the Japanese faces because he knew exactly what they had done and proceeded to tell the court, who were horrified at what they heard. Decades later, we heard very little. It was suppressed, it was covered up, and this was not so much a conspiracy of silence, if someone said, I believe it was a policy of silence, not to horrify the families, not to upset in later years the Japanese. Hence we come back to my letter to the emperor. This is unfinished business. Hirohito had tried to apologize, actually. It had tried to at least recognize what the regime under his ultimate command had done. But MacArthur slapped him down soon after the war and said, we're not having any of that here now. It's not appropriate. So this would be unfinished business. And I do say in my last, if I can just read briefly the last paragraph, which really sums up what I'm trying to do. It's not just, because many families have said to me, it won't help, Paul, because we are so disturbed by what has happened. Anything the Japanese say to us now won't really help. Others have said, I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing. But I'd have to say that the Japanese consulate in Sydney have got back to me, and I'm meeting them next week. And so they understand the ultimate purpose, which is also to alert the Japanese people. As I write, no apology can alleviate the terrible losses suffered by thousands of families, but it can atone for Japan's silence and obfuscation and render these events in the true light of history rather than as forgettable ephemera, untaught in Japanese schools and unacknowledged by the nation that perpetrated them. And your words, coming from the highest moral authority in Japan, will bring our two countries a step closer to that most elusive quality in the affairs of people, mutual understanding, which is surely the beginning of true forgiveness and friendship. Thank you very much.